Ladies and gentlemen, good evening, good night, and welcome back to another installment of Tomahawk Talk Graveyard Shift. I'm your host, Sebastian Giuliano, and tonight I'm joined by a good friend of mine at the station. Why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Glad to be here. My name's Dakota Gear, and I'm gonna be giving you a little background tonight into the upcoming big UFC event card.
Right, yeah. So here at Graveyard Shift, we're all about talking about stuff that we can't squeeze into the main show. Usually that's the unorthodox sports outside the big four here in America. We're talking stuff like motorsport, um, gymnastics, stuff like that. And then today we're talking about combat sports. So, MMA, it's something that we see when we're flicking through the channels around ESPN, going from ESPN to ESPN News or ESPN2. And you see it on like commercials and promos and stuff like that. But I personally, and I think a lot of people listening tonight, have not experienced is exactly like an entire card. And that's why when he told me a couple weeks ago that there was a really big one coming up, I wanted to get Dakota on the show so he could take us through that and kind of give us a crash course, if you will, into the wide world of MMA and combat sports. So we're going to start off with just something simple. We'll start at the very basic level. Take us through a fight because when, like I said, you're changing through the channels, you're seeing bits and pieces of MMA. You'll see dudes or women going at it, um, but you don't really like. All it seems like is just punching each other for some people. But there's more to it than that. So let's just start there.
Oh yes, there's a lot more that goes into it. With first off, with the sport of MMA, it's different from boxing in that the fights combine multiple styles. So when you're watching a fight, you may have two strikers fighting each other, but you may also have, say, the next fight. You could have someone coming in with a NCAA Division One wrestling background facing another person who may not have a wrestling background, but they may still have that same type of grappling skills from a Brazilian jiu-jitsu background. And even striking, you've got people who come in with uh, karate and taekwondo backgrounds who will focus more on striking with, say, kicks, as opposed to a boxer who will come in and work on getting in range and using the distance and striking mainly with his fists with combos.
Right, right. And kind of format. So just we compared it to kind of boxing. Can you what is the difference between like how is a round or how is a fight kind of set up?
MMA fights are set up a bit differently than the old school boxing fights. If you ever seen like the old tapes of Foreman and stuff, you'd know these are 10, 15 round affairs when you're talking about boxing, 2, 3 minute rounds. With MMA fights, they're shorter in time in overall time length, but the rounds themselves are longer. So regular fights are about 3 5 minute rounds. So you only have 3 rounds to decide, but those rounds are much more action packed than
Very
say a boxing
concentrated, right?
match.
Concentrated.
Exactly.
And I guess you talked about scoring. Like how is a winner decided if a dude's not on his back for more than a certain period of time?
Winners decided usually by a combination of significant strikes, control of either position, if it's say wrestling, takedowns, control of space in the cage, who's pushing the action, who's doing
It's
actual
kind of setting
damage
the
and
tempo of the
stuff.
fight, right?
Exactly.
Right.
Tempo of fight, who's actually controlling the pace of the fight.
Gotcha. Well, with that in mind, let's just go right for it. So this Saturday, correct? It's a
Correct.
big card for UFC, right?
Double
Let
title fight.
haven't done. So categories, things like that, are how do they exactly work? Because lots of people have heard of heavyweight, maybe featherweight or flyweight, but what do those words exactly mean?
Categories basically break down the weight classes for the UFC because it would in a fight it would basically be unfair if you had someone walking in at 205 pounds facing someone who's say 245 pounds. That 40-pound weight advantage is going to make such a huge difference, so that's why they have these weight classes. And breaking them down, basically you start at heavyweight at the heaviest, 265 to 225, and then there's light heavyweight, which is 205 pounds.
Mm-hmm.
You go down to middleweight, that's 185. You go down to welterweight, 170, and below that you start getting into the really smaller divisions like lightweight 155, featherweight 145, bantamweight 135, and even flyweight 125.
So what do you think is kind of other than weight? How is the style of combat different from the heavier weights versus the really light weights or somewhere in between? Like
Oh,
what is the biggest difference?
there, there's a huge difference, not only in terms of weight, but also this. The main difference you'll see is in the energy of the fight. If you watch the 125-pound division, one of those championship fights, you are seeing you have a chance to see some crazy techniques that you won't see a human being who's 265 pounds can do. For instance, I've seen cartwheel kicks, I've seen jumping front snap kicks, I've seen spinning back kicks, I've seen some of the craziest strikes thrown in the smaller divisions. And because they don't have that huge amount of mass to put power behind to constantly, drive those punches and kicks, they can throw a lot more. So you'll see a higher paced action usually in the lower divisions. It doesn't matter if it's striking or also wrestling. You'll see a lot of higher paced action, but you'll also in the inverse, because they don't have that size, it's a lot harder for some of them to knock each other out. So you'll tend to see more volume, more
You'll see
rounds.
longer fights, I guess. Yeah.
Exactly. You go to heavyweight, you're not going to see many fights past the first two rounds just because the size of some of these human beings. You
Interesting.
know?
So it sounds like the lighter categories are definitely more dynamic. And it's interesting that you say that because as you're kind of describing how the lighter fighters have to make up with it, have to make up their size with technique, it sounds a lot like soccer actually, where a lot of the shorter, smaller guys, I mean the most famous one of all, Lionel Messi, um, they you can't just enforce or push your way through the field and push your way downfield, right? You have to be a lot more technical. And some of the more memorable soccer players out there are in fact like smaller, shorter guys. And I imagine that must be the case in MMA. It sounds like the with how technique is and stuff like that. I mean, seeing two giant fighters just go at it is thrilling in and of itself, but the amount of technique and diversity and fighting style sounds like it's in more demand, I guess.
Oh, yes, exactly. I believe Conor McGregor a couple years ago actually said technique and timing beat speed and power. And
Yeah.
this was in reference to right after his win over Jose Aldo when he captured basically the entire homeland behind him and all of America pretty much with that win, that thunderous one punch, because of how he timed it out and studied his opponent and his mannerisms. So he knew going into that fight that Aldo was going to throw that punch. And even though Aldo, if you look at the tape, did actually connect on his punch because of McGregor's precision and timing, his got there first and knocked out Aldo before his could connect fully and do a lot of damage. And
Right.
so that's exactly as you say. Some fighters may have that speed or even power advantage at the lower levels, but because the weights, there's not a there can't be a 40-pound difference in weight like there can be in heavyweight. They're the exact same weight. That doesn't always win it for you.
Right, right. So, with that in mind, let's just get into. I think we can now go ahead and take a look at Saturday's card. Let's just go through it. Let's start at the top and then work our way down. So, how exactly is a card structured? A card, ladies and gentlemen, is in fact like kind of like the schedule, right? It's how
Correct.
the whole night is set up because it's not just one big. You'll hear about the fight, right? But there's a lead up. You can't just like let it all out all of a sudden because then you don't have an event.
Yeah, there's a litany of fights throughout the night going on basically from sundown almost till sunup the next day sometimes. So with a fight card, when they're usually talking about the fight, they're talking about the main event. This is the main build fight. This is who you're going there to see, who you're really tuning in, who the press is covering throughout the week. That's the main event. That's the main fight. That will be at the very end of the night, though. Before that, you'll have the rest of the main card, which other high-profile fighters, but they aren't getting top billing. They're not the ones headlining the act per se.
Right.
They're supporting acts almost. If you look at it through like a concert lens, and that will usually be about, when you include the main event, 5 to maybe 7 fights. But 7 fights are rare. That's like New Year's cards, stuff like that. This one for this Saturday is 5 fights on the main event card. And before that, you have the prelims, which are usually on free TV in some form. And it'll have some bigger names coming up. Not exactly bigger in terms of reach, but say the UFC has some up-and-comers who are riding a hot streak. They'll sometimes put them up in the prelims against an established name in their division who's fought top competition, maybe not at the top of their game right now, but they've consistently been in the upper crust of that division's fighters, per se.
Right. That's almost like a here's kind of what to come, like almost like a like WWE's like NXT department. It sounds like that.
Exactly, pretty much. And then you have the early prelims, which are fighters just signed. These are usually available exclusively on like the UFC's streaming service and such.
Pay-per-view, stuff like that.
Exactly.
Well,
These are
right. Gotcha.
These are ones that most people won't be able to see. Most people who tune into the early prelims are hardcore fans or people who actually are studying these fighters, maybe for upcoming fights where they might be fighting them. So they're usually not known, and they're usually people that the UFC are trying to pump up, especially on a card like this, where they've got heavier names on the back end, so get those people some exposure.
Gotcha. Let's take a look at those names. What are like 1 or 2 fights that kind of stand out for you that pop out? Any up and comers that we should be looking out for, or anybody who's kind of new, doesn't really have access to the pay-per-view platforms? Maybe some like something that in for a treat, I guess, to kind of introduce them to UFC.
Okay, well, if they're watching the early prelims, I'd definitely say watch the women's, because the UFC has been trying to pump new blood into the women's divisions, and with the early prelims, 2 of the 3 fights, there's originally supposed to be 4 actually, but the 4th one was canceled due to an illness recently.
That's
unfortunately. Sometimes happens during fight week, but it's the nature of the game. Now, there's a bantamweight and a strawweight fight for the women's on the early prelims.
All right, what do we got?
We got Polania Viana and Hannah Cyphers, 2 up-and-coming women's strawweight. The strawweight is usually a pretty active division, as you were saying earlier. The lighter divisions, there's usually more volume, and that is especially true for the women with the strawweight. They usually don't have the power to knock each other out, so you'll see a lot of vicious strikes, but they won't necessarily finish. So it ends up
usually coming to a decision, correct?
Yes, correct. But a decision that's usually a pretty brutal decision. The women, interestingly, seem to hold back less than the men. The men sometimes get a bit trepidatious in the beginning, in the feeling out stage. In some fights, sometimes the action lags. Women, usually when they go into the ring, there's no love lost in between them, pretty much, when you watch the fight.
If you want a visceral fight, then you should probably be watching the women.
Yes, the women are some of the most entertaining fights of recently that I've seen on cards, and it's very refreshing and nice, because also in the difference between male and female bodies, one interesting thing I picked up in my training with a bit of my background in martial arts is women are sometimes a lot better at striking, especially with the kicks, because with men, a lot of times we're taught to tighten our muscles and, ready ourselves for like an impact or force or something with the sports we play, like football, basketball, other such sports. With women, that's not ingrained from an early age. And with a lot of the kicks that when you're trained to do them, you don't want to have your muscles tight when you're throwing that kick. You want them loose, almost like a slingshot, so after you chamber a kick and load up that power, when your leg goes out, basically.
Right.
When you hit the extension part of the kick, you want that as my instructor said, you want to make your pants pop.
Yeah.
Not like in the club, but when you're kicking, you you want to hear the sound. One of the things we'd aim for is hearing the sound of the fabric make that audible pop, because you would want that quick slingshot effect
Range of
almost.
motion, right? Okay,
Yes.
gotcha.
You want that quick, precise strike, and the faster it is, the more power and velocity you're going to uncork in that one strike. And so that's just one of the many reasons women fights are very entertaining for me.
So the one to watch for tonight in the women's one, if you could pick one,
I would say on the early prelims, the women's bantamweight,
right?
Gina Mazzani, she's 5-2 in the UFC. She's fought some of the bigger names in that women's division, like Sarah McMahon. She did not come out on top, but she is a Ultimate Fighter veteran. From season 18, which was the season with Ronda Rousey as coach and such. So they're definitely pumping in some new lifeblood, and she is a part of that. And I would definitely say the bantamweight is the deepest division for the women's right now. So that would be the fight to check out on the early prelims for me.
All right, a lot to watch for. Let's go down that card. Let's see what's up next.
Okay, up next we got the regular prelims for this fight. These are the ones on regular cable TV. You'll actually be able to catch these on ESPN this Saturday, I believe. So just tune in. And we've got more than a couple on the docket for this fight.
All right, what do we got? What do we got? Show me.
First one we got is we've got a fighter who's very long in the tooth against a fighter who is basically a newborn baby compared to him. We got Mickey Gall versus Diego the Nightmare Sanchez.
The Nightmare.
Yes.
That is a nickname. And nicknames, obviously, in combat sports are a very big part of a person's character in that
Game of
sport.
names.
It's a game of names. All right, take us through these. Take us through these two bouts, and what do we got to look for?
Okay, you may have mentioned wrestling earlier. Do you remember how CM Punk had the foray into mixed martial arts?
Yep. Same goes for Brock Lesnar, I believe, right?
Yes. When CM Punk had his first fight, Mickey Gall was the one that he was up against. So if you ever saw that,
I didn't watch it, unfortunately. How'd that go? Did he give him a proper, warm UFC welcome?
He gave him a proper welcome. You weren't missing much by not seeing it.
Oh, boy.
Gall pretty much submitted him, and CM, kind of like when you get into a test on exam day and your brain, you get to that first question and your brain doesn't remember anything.
Yeah.
That was CM Punk in that fight. He got put in a position where he had to fight off a takedown, and his brain pretty much blanked after that. But in respect to Mickey Gall, he's finished a lot of his fights, and all of them, I believe, by submission. He's 5-1. He's only lost one fight, so.
How many of the submissions are early? Is it like is his fighting style more of a I'm going to come at you early, I'm going to see if I can force a submission in either the first or the second rounds, and after that it's kind of like a drop off, or is it later in the submissions or later in the match for a submission, or what do we got to look for?
Well, Gall's not a rush down submission artist. If you've ever seen Lesnar's fights in the UFC, how he would just go straight in and try and take him down immediately.
Like Tyson's boxing, where if you managed to last to past the fourth or fifth round, you had a significantly better chance at making it through the entire match.
I'd say Gall's more of an opportunist submission artist. So he will stand up and strike with you, but he's mainly waiting for you to present him with an opportunity so he can take advantage of that and get in an advantageous position.
Right. And what about his opponent?
His opponent is the interesting one, I'd say, here. Diego Sanchez is actually a veteran of the very first season of The Ultimate Fighter.
Wow.
Yes.
Sounds like he's been around the block for a while then.
Oh, yes. 37 years of age, and he's been fighting for at least a decade plus.
That is actually a surprise. I feel like in across all of sport, combat sport is where you see age the most. It feels like out of any sport, in boxing and in mixed martial arts, the window for a peak or just being in the sport full stop at a very competitive level is small, unless it's entertainment sports such as professional wrestling. But especially in something like MMA, this is actually a surprise for me. I mean, he sounds like a dinosaur.
Well, that's actually a pretty interesting point you make. You would think that the peak for a UFC fighter is a very small window.
Like mid 20s to late 20s at the oldest, honestly.
And that may be their athletic peak, but especially you'll see in the later divisions, you because of the amount of time it takes to accrue these skills. As I mentioned earlier, this isn't like boxing. This isn't where you go in with a singular set of skills or styles. A lot of these fighters are going in, they may be called wrestlers, but they may also be trained, say, a blue belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. They may have trained in striking as well. Because of the learning curve associated with this type of sport, you will see fighters later in the tooth. For instance, the number one pound-for-pound fighter right now, Daniel Cormier, he's 40 years old.
Wow.
Yeah, he's considering
That's
retirement.
old in every sport, full stop. Like 40 is ancient.
He's in dad years,
Yeah,
and
that
he's
is-
still going strong.
I'm guessing I'm getting like so what I'm getting from this is that it's just like with size, the way you make up for raw physical capability is with technique,
Exactly.
and that's how these older guys keep up with the younger guys. Where does this is kind of a depends on the fighter type question, but where do older fighters go in the categories and in the weight classes? Do they go up? Do they go down? Do they just stay in a spot where they've been for a few years, or where do they go?
That's a very good question as well. Before, a lot of fighters stayed in their division, and you'd see it. Some of them would get too long in the tooth, like Liddell. He ended his last 3 or 4 fights of his career getting knocked out. Just didn't have the chin anymore, but he
Right.
stayed in that division. And that's usually how it went. Either fighters would retire before they were injured, or they would retire a bit too late when you saw the
They got
symptoms
hurt,
and such
yeah.
catching up with them. But recently, because of how grueling it is for some of those weight cuts, even though fighters may have been dominant in their respective weights before. For instance, Rafael dos Anjos, former lightweight champ, he currently fights at welterweight, 15 pounds heavier, and a lot of fighters have said that's a great move. Not specifically for him, but just in general when they've made the move up for themselves. They feel healthier, they feel more energized, they feel like almost like a full version of themselves, where some before fighting in their weight divisions, when they were going through those grueling weight drops, basically dropping down to Skeletor levels of body fat.
Cuttings for
Yes.
the weigh-ins, which are where you kind of evaluate where a fighter is like physically before a fight,
Exactly.
correct? All right. Those are always a big deal. You always see them on SportsCenter and stuff like that.
Oh, huge.
The
It's
stare down and everything.
Yeah, that's an entire part of the event, not just Saturday night, but the lead up to it. They have media days, they have the weigh-ins, they have the stare downs, as you said,
Right.
and those weigh-ins are just as important as the fight themselves, because that determines if the fight even happens.
Right. All right. Well, let's move on to that second fight then. What do we got?
We got a bantamweight matchup between Alejandro Perez and Cody Starman, whose nickname, as I was mentioning before the podcast, is the aforementioned Mr. Wonderful.
Mr. Wonderful. Another fight, another great name coming out of MMA. All right, take us through our first fighter.
This one, Perez and Starman, they're both basically up and comers in the bantamweight division, which has been a pretty deep division for the UFC, especially with how they've treated the flyweight division below it. They've had fighters moving up, such as John Dodson and other such former fighters of that division, and some actually moving down from the featherweights to get a bit lighter to try and challenge for it. But these fighters, they're basically looking for a place in the top 15 of the bantamweight rankings.
Where do you see this fight going?
I see this one being a decision. They both have good records. Mr. Wonderful at 17-2. Perez is 21-6 with one no contest. I would say, due to their styles and such, Mr. Wonderful will probably take it with a decision.
Gotcha. How often do you see no contests in the across the board at UFC or in MMA in general?
No contests and draws are very rare. As I said, it's only a 3 or 5 round affair, so it makes it much easier for the judges to choose a winner and not get stuck with a hung decision. There's very rarely a draw, and no contest basically just occurs when there's either a drug-related issue discovered post-fight or an illegal strike or something. For instance, a couple of years ago when I believe it was Nick Diaz. He fought Anderson Silva a couple of years ago after Silva had lost his belt. Mm-hmm. And the fight was ruled out, even though Silva won that, the fight was ruled after as a no contest due to drug tests popping up in Silva's.
Gotcha.
Yeah, so post-fight, I believe it was the Nevada State Athletic Commission changed the ruling from a win to a no contest.
Right. Well, I think this is actually a great time to take a break. We've been on air for about 25 minutes, maybe 30. I think I'm being a little overzealous with that. But you're listening to WVFS Tallahassee, the voice of Florida State. This is Tomahawk Graveyard Shift. We'll be back after this. And welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to Tomahawk Talk Graveyard Shift. I'm Sebastian, your host, with Dakota, and we're going through the UFC card for March the 2nd, 2019.
UFC 235.
235. Where we left off, we were actually talking about the Nevada Athletic Sports Commission. Did I get that right?
Nevada State Athletic Commission.
Oh, Nevada State Athletic Commission. Sorry. We went over that like 3 times, and I still didn't get it down alive. Whatever. So, what is that exactly? Because that's interesting. It sounds like, from what we briefly discussed. One moment. What we briefly discussed. It sounds like an actual government body, like a state level or a federal level government body overseeing sport. We don't have that in the United States, or you don't see that in the United States anywhere really. I should remind you, the audience, that the Olympic commissions are private entities. They are not state-sponsored or state-run. But this sounds like something completely different. Can you explain that to our audience, please?
You actually kind of hit on it a little bit when you're saying they were a government-controlled body. The Nevada State Athletic Commission is who the UFC is partnered with for their drug testing and drug program. So the UFC does not oversee that themselves as much as the Nevada State Athletic Commission controls when testing is, the punishments for testing, doling those out and such. For instance, fighters have complained about the random tests from the NSAC, with Woodley, who we'll speak on later in the card, he had to do a test at 1 a.m. reportedly on Super Bowl night because the tester had an event, and so he was unable to attend because these tests aren't scheduled. They're completely random.
Completely random. So they just show up at your house. It's like, hey, can you pee in this cup, please?
One of them's actually had a shotgun pulled on him by a UFC fighter and former Marine before for pulling up on his lawn at like 3 a.m.
Wow, that is actually completely random. That is random taken to the extreme.
Yes.
Nevada does not mess around, I guess.
Not at all. Woodley actually lost $10K because he couldn't attend an event of his own for that test on Super Bowl night.
That must be incredibly frustrating.
Oh, yes.
But still interesting. The government obviously has gotten their fingers in professional sports, stepping in when it feels the need to. The most classic case of all time is obviously the Black Sox with match fixing and the like. But that's really interesting. And like you said, Dakota, it is partnered, correct? It's not
correct.
It's not a direct affiliation so much as a collaboration to ensure that the UFC is not doing anything by like looking
That
the
they're
other way
having clean fighters
to maintain
basically.
the integrity of the sport. Right.
Exactly.
Okay.
That was the point behind the partnership between the two.
Okay. Okay. Let's move on with our card then, where we're back again. Where did we leave off?
We left off with Johnny Walker on the prelims fighting Misha Sorkunov.
Johnny Walker. That is a name. That is an interesting name. I've met Johnny Walker. Well, I can't really say that. No. So let's see. What do we have here between these two?
Well, Sorkunov is a submission artist who's been around the light heavyweight division a little bit. Most of his wins are by submission, although in his fights with upper crust talent in the light heavyweight division, he has lost some. The real interesting fighter, as you could tell by his name for this fight, is Johnny Walker. Only 3-0 in the UFC, but he's got one of the weirdest and wildest personalities in the sport so far. For his last fight, he knocked in only 15 seconds, mind you.
That is fast.
Yes, very fast, especially for light heavyweight. Usually there's a feeling out in the first minute. No, he just went in, spinning back kick, followed by a spinning back fist to knock the dude out cold, and then proceeded to celebrate by doing a bunch of different celebrations, including, might I add, for the record, the worm, as they were checking on the other dude on the ground.
That's wow. That wasn't, and that's not a submission. That is a straight up knockout too.
Yes.
That is a surprise. So I guess we could. That is interesting. So 3-0. Not even a submission. Just go to town on the dude and dance while he's down. That is good stuff. All right, next Next up, what do we have?
Final fight of the prelims. It's a featherweight affair between top-ranked heavyweight Jeremy Stevens and another up-and-comer, Zabist Magomed Shapirov. Definitely,
that's a good name for a last name like that. I could not pronounce that on the regular.
Yes.
I sympathize with the broadcasters that have to say that.
Might get a little tongue-tied there.
All right. Wow, so this does seem like a pretty stacked card. We're looking over at your notes here.
Yes.
Stevens, 3-1 in the last 4, lost to only Aldo. And Zabist, being the ranked 13 featherweight, undefeated in the UFC currently. What can you tell us about their fighting styles?
Stevens, he's definitely a brawler. 28 wins, 19 of them by KOs, and he's had a great run of his previous few fights. Like you mentioned, his most recent fight out of the most recent 4, his only loss is to Aldo, who was the featherweight kingpin forever, as we know, until McGregor knocked him off. There's only been 2 people in the UFC to beat Aldo, and that was McGregor and then current featherweight champion Max Holloway. So stiff competition there. Right.
No shame in a loss like that then. 19 knockouts out of 21. 21.
28.
28, okay.
5-time performance of the night as well, though. So he is a very electric fighter.
Right.
Which you may be noticing as a theme here going through the prelims as we get to the main action. There's a lot of...
It is lighter. They are the lighter classes, so it's like you're saying, we're seeing a lot of like knockouts. We're not seeing a lot of submissions. Misha seems to be like an exception to that general rule. But then again, that is the light heavyweight. Then we're still, that is kind of the heavier end of the spectrum. Of the spectrum, right? And then we have Zabist. What can you tell us about him?
Zabist, he's a fighter from the Russian circuit, similar to Nurmagomedov, but he is much newer face in the UFC. 4-0 right now.
16-1-0. That's not bad.
Yes, very good professional record.
Is that including his Actually, no, that would be that's
including
out east, right?
That's including the UFC victories.
Okay.
That's the total professional victories. The rest are from the Russian circuit, though.
That actually brings up a question that I just thought of, and how often do fighters move out of their local regional circuits? Obviously, UFC is a bit different. It's the American one, therefore, and the biggest one. Usually the sport sees like an influx of talent going to the biggest stage, right? But how often do you see fighters moving from local scenes to more regional ones? How often? I'm honestly kind of out of my element here. Is it common to see, I don't know, Russian fighters down in Brazilian circuits, or are they just going once you've proven your salt in your region? Do you go straight to the UFC, or is there more of like a thing? Is it all about hype? Is it all about names? What does that look like?
Well, I believe it's a combination of experience and, as you were mentioning at the end, hype as well. Because you see some of these fighters, they come in and they have huge amateur records, but you're just now hearing of them in professional fights. And they've fought everywhere across the globe. But then you'll see some that say they got an NCAA background, For instance, there's a light heavyweight on the UFC's roster who is a former Division I football player. It didn't take him too long after Division I football to get picked up due to his name recognition,
Right.
and also the athletic recognition associated with what he did and such. So it really depends on the fighter almost. But as you were saying, some of those more overseas, it's more difficult to get out of that area.
Right.
Because the UFC, if you're trying to get to the UFC, it's a lot of its shows are in America or Brazil. Those are the top two markets for professional fighting. If you're in Russia, it's going to be a bit harder. You've got to really make a name for yourself on that Russian circuit.
Gotcha. And other than those two really big markets, where are kind of if we can call them scenes, where are the big, or circuits actually? That's a better name for them. What are the other like big regional circuits to watch apart from, because you always hear about the big two, right? The United States circuit, or the North American circuit, and the Brazilian circuit. But where else do you kind of see like hotbeds of talent?
I would look in the Asian Pacific market. The Philippines, you have fighters from the Philippines. The current featherweight champ Max Holloway is actually from Hawaii itself. So
Right.
you look there, you'll find some really good fighters. Japan, China, one championship. The organization that traded fighters with the UFC, which was historical because there's never been trades among professional
That sounds
fighting
interesting.
organizations.
Instead of trading teams or I guess in professional wrestling, there are such things as like wrestlers that'll wait for their contract to expire to sign with other organizations than the WWE. But that sounds interesting. Circuits trading players. Do they trade for conditional draft picks or?
Oh, that would
How
be
does that
very
work?
interesting. It probably wouldn't be draft picks. It'd most likely be somewhat akin to independent contractor trading for their rights,
Gotcha.
I believe. So when the trade went down between one championship, which is mainly Asian professional fighting organization, with UFC, when they made that trade, they were basically trading the rights of the fighters to fight for their organizations.
Gotcha.
It wasn't a technical trade in that full trade in that they exchanged contracts. It was more of, okay, we're going to agree to release both our fighters, and they can go to pretty much swap organizations without interference or such.
Gotcha. All right. Well, with that in mind, let's move on to the next step on our card. What do we have next?
So now we got the main card. We got the main action everyone's
The
tuning
big show.
in
The
for.
big show.
Exactly.
Awesome.
To start off the main card, we got Cody Garbrandt, Mr. No Love.
These names are great. I'm eating this stuff up because these names are, they're characters. They give them personality. I love it. I love it.
That's part of the fight game. You got to be a very good character. You got to and draw in the audience and trance them. It's all part of fight week. You got the stare down, the walk in, the fight song. You got Bruce Buffer in there hyping the entire crowd up. It's about creating that atmosphere too.
It's equal parts strength, power, technique, and showmanship.
Exactly.
It's wonderful. It's wonderful. All right. So, what to look for in this fight? Take us through for Mr. No Love.
Well, Mr. No Love has been getting no love in his past two fights. He's lost both of them vying for that bantamweight strap with former teammate T.J. Dillashaw. And he lost both pretty convincingly, especially the second one. And so this This is a get-right fight for him. He's looking for a statement win. He's looking to get back on track. He started off 11-0. You know, his 11th fight, he knocked out Dominic Cruz to take the title. But then he subsequently lost his past two. He lost the title and then lost the rematch. So he's looking to get back on track.
Right.
And as I might have been saying earlier, even though some of these lighter divisions, they don't have the power, Garbrandt is actually the exception to the rule on that. Because most of his fights have been ended with knockouts. Even the ones he lost.
KO artist, then. Interesting.
Yeah, even the ones he lost have ended in knockouts, so...
Live and die by the sword, I guess.
Exactly.
And his opponent, Pedro Munoz?
Yes, he's the number 9 bantamweight.
I see on your notes, by guillotine choke. That line stands out to me. What is a guillotine choke?
Okay, so that's basically, say a fighter goes... almost like a football tackle, you know? They put their shoulder in your stomach and they go to take you down.
Right.
When you trap their neck in between your side and your arm.
Right.
So almost like a bully choke, but the reverse, you know? Right. Got you in that bully headlock almost, but since your head is facing the opposite way, they're putting pressure on the sides of your neck and they're almost sinking down to the ground with you to sink the arm underneath their chin.
All right, and that's a form of getting a submission, I'm guessing?
Yes.
All right.
If you hear guillotine, Darce choke, armbar, those are all just different types of technical submissions.
Gotcha. And how long do you have to be pinned in a guillotine choke for either the official in the octagon to call it, or?
Well, basically the official.
The opponent have to kind of.
Usually it's by tap, but you get some who are a bit stubborn where once they stop fighting or moving consciously, then it'll be called, you know, because you got a couple stubborn fighters, like they'll keep fighting, and as long as there's movement or struggle to get out of the choke, you're good until you tap or until you're just out.
Right.
But that can be to the detriment of some fighters, as I was mentioning. Some wait too long, and then, you know, the lights go out and everything.
Right. So it sounds like it's a make or break for both fighters this weekend.
Yes.
And it looks like we've got on one end we've got Mr. No Love who will be looking for a KO. Whereas his opponent will be looking for more of a technical takedown. What usually happens when you have, because those records are more or less the same, relatively speaking, other than Cody's two-match slide. What happens usually when you see kind of a KO specialist or someone who has a propensity of living and dying by the KO take on a more technical fighter? Does it boil down to strength? Like, how is tempo determined, or is it just like a fight by fight?
It's very interesting stylistically to watch some of those fights like this when the styles clash so much. It's not, as you're saying, it's not strength against strength. Usually, who actually wins that is whoever's got whoever's better able to defend against their weakness. So,
gotcha.
Say the dude's going in for a guillotine choke, but he's got to be able to set up that guillotine choke. He's got to be able to get the opponent in position. And if he can't get in a position to even set it up, then there's no chance of him being able to actually get it off, let alone in a good, secure position where he can really crank the pressure on the neck. Now, if you're a knockout artist, protecting against submissions and stuff, you got to have a good takedown defense. You can stand up and trade blows, and that may be your forte all day, all round. But if you get both legs taken out from under you and your back's on the ground and you're getting your head pounded in, it's not so easy to get back up and knock someone out.
All right.
One of the worst places to be in on a fight is on the ground.
I can imagine. Being on your back seems like a death sentence for the most part. Moving on, we've got the next section on the main event, right? We're still in the main event.
Yes, we're still in the main event. This time we got the women's strawweight coming up. Very interesting fight, I will say. I'm looking forward to this women's one. Got Tisha the Tiny Tornado Torres facing Wiley Zhang. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that right.
That sounds right.
She hasn't gotten that much. Zhang is another rising star, another newcomer. She beat Jessica Aguilar, who is an established name in the strawweight division, in her last fight. It wasn't a very televised fight. It was like 3 a.m. on Black Friday.
Jeez.
But she beat her so soundly, she got moved up from prelims straight to the main card.
Wow. How often does that doesn't sound very common.
That is not very common at all.
Must have had a wave of hype behind her then.
15 stoppages in it so far with an 18-1 record. She's got a...
Pardon my ignorance, but what is a stoppage?
Stoppage, that's basically an umbrella term for KO, submission, anything that doesn't
okay.
end in a decision.
Okay, gotcha. It's
So-
just whenever a fight ends, essentially, other than, at the end when it's you have to end.
Exactly.
Gotcha. All right. Anything to look out for in particular in this match? It seems like we've got 2-0. Yeah. So we've got a new face going up to the main card, facing a more established name.
Yes, number 7 in the rankings for now. That's where Torres sits in the strawweight rankings.
Does age have as much of an impact in the women's categories as it does in the men's? We've already talked about how age isn't the end for a fighter in the men's categories. It's rather just kind of you adjust to the age. Is it the same thing for women, or do women fall off quicker?
I would say so far, women's fighting in the UFC, it doesn't have the history that men's had so far, just because of how new a lot of the divisions are. They're only a couple years old, as opposed to like some of the men's divisions, which are decades old now.
Right.
But women do seem to retire a bit earlier.
Right.
So far, and that could be just because of the trend of athletes wanting to protect their body and brain, as we've seen, but also they usually retire around like 30, 31, 33, as I've noticed. So that
does seem that's significantly younger. If we've got fighters that are
Yes.
37 years old in the men's categories.
Yes, definitely not as long in the tooth, but there are exceptions to that rule with the women that prove it directly wrong. You got Holly Holm, who came in as a former professional boxer at 36 years of age, I believe.
Right.
And she's done very well for herself across multiple divisions.
Do you think that then the trend of retiring early is an MMA thing? Do female boxers last longer? Are you familiar with that, or do you think that it's more of a I'm in this environment for a certain period of time. I think my body has had enough, because MMA obviously is extremely stressful on the
Very
physical.
grueling.
Yeah, the word of the day, I think, with how you've explained both categories, is grueling. Do you think like female boxers experience the same thing as their MMA counterparts? Is her story in particular coming into MMA so late something that's unique, or is it something that you can see reasonably often?
I think the trend with retiring earlier has less to do with the sport and more to do with the science that has come out recently behind injuries and prevention and rehab and such in all the other sports.
CTE, yeah.
Exactly. You look at football, you got football players retiring earlier. You look at other sports, people are generally starting to retire earlier now.
Microconcussions and things like that.
Exactly.
Okay. So we got Torres and Zhang. All right, what's next?
Next on up, we get to the fight I'm probably looking forward to the most, at least visually, just to sit back and enjoy and watch on this card. And that would be Robbie Lawler versus the person we were talking about being traded to UFC earlier on the cast, Ben Askren, a.k.a. Funky.
Right. So Askren, where is he coming in from?
He's coming in from the One Championship fighting organization, which is mainly located in Asia, Pacific Asia for its events. So not a lot of airtime on our side of the world.
I mean, we're asleep when
Exactly.
those dudes are, when those fighters are throwing hands. So that's interesting. So we've got Ruthless, who's 28-12, the 40 matches. That seems like a long career in UFC or overall, but that is. You've got
he's been around since
he's been around the block a
2003.
few times. Wow, That is
Yeah.
a long time to be in
He
the ring.
actually, for
In the
interesting little
octagon.
tidbit of information on Robbie Lawler, he was one of the rising prospects early in the UFC that was hyped up. He had a couple losses, fell out of the organization entirely, and then mid to late 2000s worked his way back into the organization and ended up coming back and becoming the welterweight champion. And not only becoming the welterweight champion, but defending it twice and having some of the best fights I have ever seen in MMA in doing so.
Is he a submission fighter or a KO artist?
Oh, he is a KO artist all the way.
He does not hold any punches. Seems like he also had quite the career in the NCAA. What can you
That
tell us
would be
about
Askren, actually,
Oh,
or the
I'm sorry,
NCAA.
then.
But,
Oh.
no, that's all right. Askren has a very interesting NCAA record as well.
Right. Which
He-
makes it interesting that he was traded then, but I'll let you tell us that story.
Well, for one, in his junior and senior year of NCAA Division I wrestling, the man was 87-0 and beat people who would go on to be two-time champions in Division I wrestling in the NCAA. He's actually third all-time in wrestling for the NCAA in pins with 91. Just insane amount of wrestling expertise. Went to the Olympics in freestyle wrestling, something he wasn't versed in, and got to the quarterfinal.
87-0. That's not that's
That's an
that is
insane
prolific.
record.
That is actually in any sport. If you can go 87 matches uncontested, I think that you've earned your spot, and that game's legend.
You've showed your dominance in
Yes.
the legacy of that sport.
Absolutely. So how long has he been on the professional level then?
He's been fighting for about a decade, I say.
Oh, okay.
He went from the Bellator organization, where he was the welterweight champ and defended that. Once he got the title, he defended that 4 times, never gave it up. And after that, his contract was up. He went over to the One Championship, where he became the welterweight champion there, and defended it 3 times. Never lost. He's 18-0 in his career, so
It seems like wherever he goes, he just leaves a trail of fire on his wake. That is really impressive stuff. That makes me excited to see what he has for in store for UFC.
yes, this is why I'm looking forward to this fight, because you've got Askren, who's such a prolific and great wrestler throughout his career, and he came out of retirement because of this trade. You know, the UFC, they traded Mighty Mouse, the flyweight champ, after he lost the title, because even though he had defended it so many times and was one of the best pound-for-pound fighters, he wasn't really a draw for the UFC.
Yeah.
So they were looking for a new name to pump up business and such.
Hype once again.
Exactly.
Showmanship, hype. And it's one of the pillars of combat sport.
And Askren had been pretty good at that before. Ironically, he had beefed a little bit with Dana White on Twitter and stuff before, but they kind of buried the hatchet a little bit after this trade, and so now he's beefing more with other fighters.
That's good. So he's trying to step into that heel role, if you will. Sounds like.
More nonchalantly, but yes, like
Yeah.
he'll
Gotcha.
make some call outs and stuff. So
All right. Now we're moving on to what I believe is the penultimate fight on our card between 2 fighters. Why don't you take us through that?
yes, we got the co-main coming up now. This is where the title fights start. For this fight, we got the welterweight strap on the line. We got Tyron Woodley. He's fighting another up-and-comer that the UFC is trying to promote, the Nigerian Nightmare, Kamaru Usman.
Once again, those nicknames. So, fighting style. Let's just go through that.
So, Woodley, background in Division I wrestling, really good wrestler, but his fighting style is... His punches could basically knock anyone out. This would be like Thanos punching you almost. He
Thanos
puts
punch,
people
Thanos
to
punch.
sleep and into another dimension when he lands the punches right.
Oh boy. So we've got. I'm guessing that would lead to early knockouts. Early knockouts is what I see then.
He's got early knockouts, but he's been at the he's been at this game a minute. He knows how to defend a title. He knows the song and dance. He's faced a submission wrestler and Damian Maya where it was a very boring fight to watch, but that's because he never let Maya get to his game, which was on the ground. He kept him standing up, so even though he didn't knock him out, it was just a complete rout. So he may not always, if he doesn't deliver the knockout, he may not always give you the most exciting fight, but he's always been dominant in his fights.
Gotcha. And now Usman. More technical or a bit of the same?
Usman also has a background in NCAA wrestling, just at Division II, so not as thoroughbred a background, I would say. But ironically, despite that background, nearly all of his wins have come from knockout, and if they haven't come from knockout, they've come from decision.
Sounds like it's a pound for pound fight.
Yes, he's more of like a style knockout artist. He was the winner of the Ultimate Fighter when it was American Top Team versus Black Zillions, so he does have some accomplishments under his belt.
Gotcha.
But this is him vying for the spotlight.
All right. And now, last but certainly not least, are the probably what most people will be tuning into, the biggest fight of the night: John Bones Jones versus Anthony Lionheart Smith. Take it away, my friend.
Very interesting fight. Lionheart, he's usually fought in another weight division, but he moved up to light heavyweight recently, and he's 3-0 currently, riding a very good hot streak, where he's beat a couple big names. He put Rashad Evans out of his misery in one of his last fights. He beat Shogun Rua. Also, he's beat both of those by KO, and he beat another top light heavyweight contender in his most recent bout, Volkan Ozdemir, via submission. So he's riding a 3-fight win streak in this division after moving up in weight.
Time for I guess knockouts, right? 4 minutes, 1 minute 30 seconds, and 53 seconds. Fast fights.
Yes, very fast fights. As we mentioned earlier, these heavier divisions, it's a lot harder to take these punches with all that mass and power behind them. So,
Right.
Especially with someone, you look at Anthony Smith's record, he may not have the amount of fights in the light heavyweight division as most would like to see, but he's been fighting a long time through various divisions. He's 31, 13-0, and he's fought in multiple organizations, so he's got experience fighting.
All right, and our last fighter of the night, John Jones. Pretty famous name, I would say. I, as someone who's kind of a stranger looking on the outside in, have heard bits and pieces of. Well, I've heard of Jones.
Some of his escapades.
I mean, he's had at least a few run-ins with the NSAC. Why don't you go ahead and tell us about that?
Well, interestingly, before about 15 to 18 months ago, he was suspended in 2017 for a metabolic steroid showing up in his tests. And he had been caught before on illegal substances in a pre-fight test, but that was for cocaine, so it wasn't a performance-enhancing substance, and so the ban, he didn't get anything for that ban pretty much.
Right.
That affected his fighting career. It was more outside the fight, you know.
It was just, well, I get it, yeah. Where it's more of a, it's a hit on his that fourth pillar, which is his reputation.
Yes,
his
reputational.
Pillar, rather than his core fighting ability and/or his capability to fight.
Which has been a lot of
sportsman.
which has been a lot of his mess ups. They've been more on it, focused on his reputation and outside the league. The cocaine test, the hit and run. He's had a couple of them, but for our purposes tonight, we'll focus on his dealings with the NSAC. He had that suspension, as I mentioned, 15 months ago that covered that amount of time. In his first fight back, there were tests, and they found trace amounts of that same metabolic steroid in his bloodstream in those tests before his previous fight. There was arguing between the NSAC and some people on Jones' side who are trying to prove scientifically that it wasn't him taking the drugs again. It was rather a pulsating effect that it was almost picking up traces of the previous test, how the drug stayed in his system, basically, is what they were saying.
Is this his first fight after that suspension?
No, actually, he had one a couple months ago. The one I was just talking about there, where they first picked up on these trace amounts, and they couldn't really decide on it. So what they did was they moved the entire fight card to California so he could still fight and everything until they could resolve this. And for this fight, just today, there was a report that 2 tests showed traces of the same steroid metabolite. But because those tests were in the same range of the one that was flagged a couple months ago, the NSAC believes that it's residual from the original test that he was fined and suspended 15 months for. So the fight's still a go.
Okay. So we did talk about how, this has affected his reputation or just what people think about Jones whenever he comes up in a conversation. But how big is there an asterisk after every one of his fights? Is there do people question it a lot, or do people believe, oh, this is just the NSAC kind of leaning too hard on a fighter, or what is the word on the street in that sense? Or after a fight, just
I would say that especially after the first test, there hasn't been any reactions to this one yet because this literally broke about 40 minutes to an hour ago. But
wow.
After the previous test where it showed traces, I'm not sure about the public reaction, but he's already had so many, flags, as you were saying, reputationally, not only like inside the ring but outside, that fellow fighters will, instead of coming to his defense, which you would normally see against the NSAC, because a lot of them do not like him, as I mentioned, the random testing.
Right.
They're very skeptical of him.
Interesting.
So
interesting. So you did say the fight to watch for you tonight is down in the prelim cards.
Yeah,
right?
Ruthless Robbie Lawler versus Ben Askren.
Yeah.
Lawler has 2 fights of the year, and he's been declared fighter of the year twice. So, win or lose, he's one of those fighters. You tune into his fights, you're going to get an entertaining show.
All right. Well, be sure to look forward to it. And this fight is going to be a Saturday night, rather, March 2nd, 2019. It'll be UFC 235. And with that, I think our coverage has ended. Thank you very much, Dakota. If there's anything else is there anything else you want our audience, because you've kind of taken them through Mixed Martial Arts 101, anything else that they should really know or look forward to if they were to look into watching a UFC card, such as the one on Saturday night?
Just enjoy the spectacle of the event. It's not only the fight. You're going to have the walkthrough. You're going to have the intro fights. You're going to have Bruce Buffer announcing everyone. You're going to have that hype. Enjoy the entire spectacle, because you mentioned the connection with the WWE earlier. This is a sport, but it's also part entertainment, so don't just tune in for the sport. Yes, enjoy the entire show. If you're going to be watching all these fights, you might as well enjoy everything.
Right. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, that is a wrap on another episode of Tomahawk Talk Graveyard Shift. Thank you very much for tuning in this week. We'll hopefully be back next week with another exciting installment. From Sebastian, myself, and from Dakota, thank you very much. I'd like to thank you also, Dakota, for coming out tonight. This has been a fantastic episode. Had a lot of fun learning about combat sport.
Thank you for having me on the show.
No, absolutely. It is my pleasure. And next time there's a card, here's hoping we can hear it from you again.
Feel free to pick my mind if I'm around.
All right. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, we'll be signing off. Thank you very much, and have a good night.